Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent, Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. Settle in, get comfy, get in your comfortable chair, put the coffee on, get the tea going, hot chocolate if you're so inclined, put your feet up, relax. If you're driving across the country in a truck and a car, keep those eyes on the road, folks. Ease off the gas pedal ever so slightly. For the next hour, we're going to take you on a journey. Canada. Now, folks, this country is known for its stories. From coast to coast to coast, everyone has a story. Now, some of those stories go back millennia. They've been passed down through word of mouth from generation to generation. Some are but weeks old. And some, like our story tonight, take place in the middle of the previous century. The year's 1938, folks. Daniel Dodge. Now, many of you are going to say, Dodge, wait a second, you think he could be a relation to? And indeed he is, folks. He was the son of the multimillionaire John Dodge, who was the founder, of course, of the Dodge Motor Car Company. Now, our story today is going to take place in northern Ontario on a small remote island called Manatoulin Island. Manatoulin Island, folks, is just to the west of Sudbury in northern Ontario. If you're going across the Trans-Canada Highway heading west or east, stop off on Manatoulin Island and visit this area that we're going to be discussing tonight. Now, Daniel Dodge, 1938, had been married only 13 days. And I say this because there was a lot of controversy around this marriage. Daniel, of course, was this heir apparent. He was all set to inherit all these millions of dollars, multimillionaire. And all of a sudden he falls in love with this local Manitoulin girl. Now, the family, of course, was dead set against this. It sounds like a movie, and perhaps it should be one day because it's part of our Canadian heritage. Family's dead set against this girl. She's a local girl and uncommon girl, and 1938, of course, folks, and there was always that gap between the affluent and those who did not have anything. But he was in love. He married the girl. 13 days later, he's dead. And that's the mystery. Was he, in fact, murdered by this young bride in order to have her inherit all his wealth? Or was there a more mundane, everyday excuse for his death? And that's where we're going to go tonight. Our guest tonight, Rick Nelson, if you remember that name and you're looking at his face right now, he's a local Kingston fella who used to host the morning show right here on CKWS in Kingston, Ontario. This is going to be a wonderful journey for you, a wonderful story for you to watch and learn about our Canadian heritage tonight. Don't go anywhere. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the show tonight. I'm excited tonight. We're going to be talking about some Canadian folklore. That folklore takes place, folks, in northern Ontario on a small remote reserve, an island called Manatoulin Island. It's about 100 kilometers west of Sudbury. Easy way to get to it. Just go right along the Trans-Canada Highway. You run into Sudbury. Just keep going. You're going to run into Manatoulin Island. And that's where our story takes place tonight. It's a mystery. 1938, a fellow by the name of Daniel Dodge, heir apparent to the Daniel Dodge Company, millions of dollars. 20-year-old guy, been married only 13 days, ends up dead. Now, was there foul play involved? or was it just an accident? And that's where we're going to go right now. First of all, I want to welcome Rick Nelson to the show. Welcome back, Rick. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Night Fright.
Hi,
Thanks for joining us.
Brent.
There you are. He's via
Brent.
Skype. How you doing?
Hi, how are you? How do you read me? Am I coming through okay?
You're
I know
coming
it's
through
probably pretty
great.
scary for your viewers, but happy to be back in Kingston, and hello to all my friends. Wonderful town to be in, Brent. You're so lucky.
Tell me about it. It's just beautiful. You know, I've been very lucky, folks. I was born and bred in Montreal, just spent the past 3 years and a little bit in Sudbury, Ontario, where I met Rick, oddly enough. Wonderful folks in Sudbury. And now, since December, we've been in Kingston, and I'm loving it. I can't tell you how much I love Kingston. It reminds me so much of my hometown of Montreal, the West Island. Rick, what brings you to Manatoulin Island from Kingston? How did you get from Kingston to Manatoulin Island? We'll cover that first, and then we're going to go into the Daniel Dodge mystery.
Well, there was a little stop in between Kingston and Manitoulin Island, and then you touched upon Sudbury. I lived in Sudbury for many years. Now, just to go to preamble that, I was from Southern Ontario, grew up in Prince Edward County, but got my start in radio in Kingston at the now defunct CKLC. But eventually Destiny took me up to Sudbury, and I was there for many, many years. And when I was in Sudbury, I purchased some property on Manatoulin Island. And I have spent a great deal of quality time on Manatoulin ever since. Of course, I eventually got back down to Kingston and spent a few years on radio down there. But now I'm back on Manatoulin, and with a bit of a career change, while I still am doing some freelance work in broadcasting and radio, I am the curator of a museum called the Old Mill Heritage Center,
Let's
which
go
is
there.
it's in Kagawan, which is on Manatoulin Island. So that sort of sets you up for the story of Daniel Dodge, I guess.
Where should we begin with Daniel Dodge? Now, I've explained to the folks that Daniel Dodge was, of course, the heir apparent for the Dodge fortune. He was the son of the late John Dodge, who discovered the Dodge Car Company, worth millions and millions of dollars. The year's 1938. 20-year-old kid, early 20s, married for 13 days, and he's dead. And on top of
Yeah.
it, the family was dead set against this marriage. How do we get into this and explain to the folks what we think happened?
I guess we start with Daniel's mother, Matilda. Somehow she was involved in the purchasing of some property on Manatoulin Island. While it's in Daniel's name, when we went to the registry office to learn more about this property that the event took place on, it's Daniel's name on the registry. But as I understand it from the locals, that Matilda, his mother, wife of John Dodge, the Dodge Motor, the president of the Dodge Motor Company. The property was in his name, and so he used it as his leisure time. He would come up, and this is just a young lad too. He's only 17, 18 when the property is bought, and he would spend his summers up on Manatoulin Island and stay at this place, which eventually became known as the Dodge Lodge, and it's just outside of Kagawan, Ontario. Beautiful lodge. And during his time on Manatoulin Island, he would drop in and visit the locals. And the story would go that when Daniel Dodge was coming into town, if word got in and around the villages that he was coming to town, all the ladies, the eligible bachelorettes, would make sure that they
I bet.
were noticed. But as I understand it, he came in to make a telephone. He didn't have any phone service out of the lodge, so he would have to come into town to make phone calls back to Detroit, which is where his family was in Detroit. So he went into one of these telephone operating stations in Gore Bay, which is also on Manatoulin Island, and there she was, Lorraine McDonald. I guess he fell in love with her right there, and they started dating, and they dated on and off for a few years, and then eventually got married. As you say, against the wishes of the Dodge family, because she was, in the eyes of the Dodge family, a commoner. And
There you go. Now, when he met her, he was just a teenager, I suspect.
Yes.
Did he come back during the winter months, the off peak months, as I guess you would call them, to date her in between?
I see no evidence of Dan being up here in the wintertime. He had a boat, he had a car, he had a plane. But I never heard of him being up here in the winter time. I suppose he could have come up here because that place was winterized. Well, I have no pictures of him. Let's put it that way, of him being up here. I have lots of pictures of Daniel Dodge, but I don't have any pictures of him up in the wintertime. He spent a good portion of the summer here, and as I say, he had a lot of toys that he could use. And best to be used in the summertime, so that's probably why he only came up in the summer.
I see. Folks, Rick Nelson's our guest tonight, and you may recognize his face, recognize that name and that voice, that silky smooth voice, because indeed, folks, he is the same Rick Nelson. If you were in Kingston while he was on the radio, he hosted the morning show on CKWS, which used to be CK...
It used to be GTO 960.
I see.
So it was. It's no longer there. It used to be the AM station, which was 960 on the AM dial, and for years, obviously, just known as CKWS radio. But it had a few name changes over the years. I was there when it was known as GTO 960, and after I left, it wasn't a few more years after that they actually shut down the AM station. I believe it's called CKWS FM now.
Okay, fair enough. Now, you're in Manatoulin Island, and you start to do some research on this Daniel Dodge fellow. Now, folks, just to bring you back up to speed, Daniel Dodge, of course, a 20-year-old son of the late John Dodge. He's just found this woman that he's just fallen in love with, that he's about to get married. Now, there's a whole mystery surrounding this because the family's not enthralled with this girl. She's, quote-unquote, a commoner. There was still that class... chasm between the two in those days, and perhaps it still exists a little bit today, but certainly not like it was in the 30s. And all of a sudden he's in love with this local girl, Manatoulin Island, Northern Ontario, and the family is terrified that this woman just wants to marry their wonderful little son just for the money. And we're going to pick it up there. Now, where we left off, Rick, he had just fallen in love with her. I'd asked you if you'd been up there for the winter, and you weren't sure. Now, can you tell us a little bit of background about the woman he fell in love with? What type of family did she come from? A lot of kids, only a few kids, rich families, poor family?
No, it wasn't a rich family. Her father was a tugboat captain, local tugboat captain, and had some siblings. A small family, actually, when you consider back then, large families seemed to be the norm, and was very well liked within the community. She got along with and was befriended by quite a few people on Manatoulin Island. So she was a popular girl in her own right on Manatoulin.
Rick, what did she do for a living? She
was a telephone operator.
Oh, that I see.
Yeah, so that's where they met, because he had to come into the local telephone location, which was in Gore Bay, and that's where they met. Now, I heard a second story. Now, I can't confirm it, but one of the locals told me another version of how they met. And Daniel, again, he was a summer guy. He had a speedboat. He liked to drive around with it. And the other story I heard was that he came into Gore Bay one day, and there she was sun tanning out on one of the docks. And that caught his attention as well.
Oh, his attention. That's what they call it now. Okay.
Yeah. Now one of the locals, one of the old timers here. Remember, we're talking 70, 80 years ago. But one of the old timers remembers her vividly as, like the Marilyn Monroe of Manatoulin Island. She was a very attractive lady. He remembers her very well. So he could understand why Daniel would have fallen in love with her. So that's the second version. I don't know which one is true, but it sounds more like him having to go in to make a telephone call, and which is the official version that I've heard is how they met.
And I suspect she was probably beautiful in her own right as well. Now, he was also a little bit of a recluse. He was kind of wild, wasn't he? I mean, you mentioned he had a sports car. You mentioned that he had his own airplane and a speedboat. I understand there was a story about him in the falls. There's a small falls on Manatoulin Island, folks, and I'm going to put the pictures up because we were there last summer ourselves. And could you tell that story a little bit about Daniel? This
Well,
guy's only 20, remember?
yeah. What I heard, the same. Well, it's coming from the same guy that told me the story about Daniel seeing her for the first time sunbathing. He also told me about the incident. It was a potential incident. It didn't happen, but he wanted to take his car over Bridalveil Falls. Now we refer to some of us at least refer to Bridalveil Falls as the Niagara of the North. It's it's a very impressive waterfall, and in the spring especially, that's a good time to see it. It's in full action in the springtime. Well, that's when he wanted to drive that thing over the falls. It's probably maybe a 60 to 90 foot drop from the top to the crest over.
I would say
He wanted to take his vehicle over, drive it over the falls, and see what would happen when he landed. Obviously, a very bad headache, I would think.
a little bit Michigana. So he's a
But he was
little bit.
bit of a daredevil. He liked to push the envelope, which is what led to his demise, and we're going to get into that for sure.
Absolutely. We're getting to the juice in just a couple of seconds, folks. We're just laying the groundwork, if you will, the foundation for this story. We're talking about the Daniel Dodge mystery, a true Canadian mystery. Daniel Dodge, the heir apparent to the Dodge fortune, 1938, marries a local girl, Manatoulin Island, Northern Ontario. 13 days later, he shows up dead. Now, was there malice involved, or was it just a plain old accident? We've already given a little bit of background about his character. He's kind of a wild guy. He's only 20 years old, don't forget. He's got all this money. He finally manages, Rick, to convince his family to let him get married. Did they get married on Manatoulin Island, or was it?
No, they got married in Detroit at a place called Meadowbrook Hall, which is still available for the public to go and see. It's still there, and just in a suburb of Detroit, Rochester, Michigan, I believe it is, and a huge castle. Think of the Clampetts from Beverly Hills times 5, and you've got Meadowbrook Hall, and this is where this fellow, a young lad, grew up. He even had a lodge that was built on Meadowbrook Hall, on the estate of Meadowbrook Hall, that looked exactly like the lodge up on Manatoulin Island. So, if he wanted to have some quiet time away from his mother, who was quite a dictatorial woman, and he needed to get away from that from time to time. If he couldn't go up to Manatoulin Island, he would just go over to the lodge that he had built on the property and tinker away on his toys in there.
Well, that begs a question, and folks, I want to tell you all the information today, folks. It's on a website. You can reach that link for the website at www.nightfrightshow.com, www.nightfrightshow.com. As always, click on the picture for today's guest. That'll take you right to the website, but I'm going to give the URL out anyways, and that's virtualmuseum.ca. Once there's a search engine little box. Just type in Daniel Dodge, Dodge. I took outside a car going by, and you'll get the spelling. This begs a few questions, Rick. How remote was the lodge, and can you describe to our audience as best you can what the lodge looks like, the size, and the surrounding areas?
Well, originally back then in 1938, it wasn't just the lodge that he owned. It was the property that encompassed the lodge, and at that time there was about 500 acres of woodland. It's situated outside of the village of Kagwan, and I don't know if you're going to be showing a map of Kagwan, but it's right in the center of Manatoulin Island, which is not much different than Prince Edward County as far as geography, size, and that. and on the shores of Lake Huron, known as the North Channel. I guess in Prince Edward County, they call it the Bay of Quinte, and the northern part of Prince Edward County up there in Manitoulin Island, it's known as the North Channel. Southern part of Prince Edward County down here is known as Lake Ontario. Up there, they call it, it's known as Lake Huron. So he was, his lodge on all this acreage was off of big water. And the lodge itself was a log cabin. It was a cedar cabin, or not a cabin, lodge estate that was built by local people for the previous owner.
I see. And how did you get into it? You mentioned you had an airplane. Was that the only way in, and perhaps the boat?
You could drive. It's about, now back then it was more of a pasture trail than a road. But it was about 7 or 8 miles outside of the town of Kagwan. So to get there by road, it was 7 miles. You could fly into it. We had a float plane, so he could fly directly to the lodge that way, or he could take a speedboat, which he had. So he had 3 different modes of transportation to get out to the lodge. But in all 3 of these cases, you were going to a very remote area. Far away from medical attention if anybody got hurt out there.
And that's important in our story that's going to be revealed in just a few seconds. Now, also, can you describe the size of the lodge? Was it a huge lodge, 3, 4, 5 floors, or was it single?
It was there was 2 parts to the lodge. There was a servants' quarters. And then the other component of the lodge was the family quarters, and that was made up of several rooms. There was probably, I mean, I've never counted, but there's got to be at least 10 bedrooms in the large family quarters area. Huge den, living room, huge fireplace, still there today, just mammoth.
We're going to have to get into that as well.
Yeah.
Folks, we're getting to the juice right now. I just want to set it up once again. We're talking about the Daniel Dodge mystery. Our guest today is Rick Nelson. As always, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on the picture associated with tonight's guest. That'll take you right to a spot where you can get all this information. In this case, it'll be Rick's website for the museum that he is curator of on Manatoulin Island. We are indeed talking about the Daniel Dodge mystery, and I say that with emphasis because indeed it is a mystery. Rick has taken us to the far reaches of northern Ontario on a place called Manatoulin Island, which is a remote island where Daniel Dodge has a lodge, Daniel Dodge being the heir apparent to the Dodge fortune. Manatoulin Island, folks, is a little bit west, I would say about 100 kilometers, not quite, of Sudbury. If you're going along the Trans-Canada, you're going to run through Sudbury. Your next stop will be Manatoulin Island. I urge you all to stop by and see Rick's wonderful museum, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Daniel Dodge, 20 years old, has married a local girl from Manatoulin Island. The family dead set against it. They're worried that she's just going to steal his money. 13 days later, he's dead. Rick, can you take us to that day when he died?
Yeah, I'll take you there. It happened in the middle of the summer, middle of August actually. So the wedding had taken place just 13 days prior at Meadowbrook Hall. Despite the fact that the family was against the wedding, they still hosted the event, and it was a small group of people that got together for the wedding. And then they went on up, drove on up to Manatoulin Island, and began the honeymoon. Not only were they there, there was a cook, and there were caretakers that were on the property. So there was not just the bride and groom that were hanging out there. And on day 13, Daniel had discovered some dynamite that was left over with the previous owner. Actually, he had seen it before and was interested in experimenting with it, but he was talked out of it by one of the caretakers. This time, curiosity got the best of him, and he dug up the dynamite and brought it into a garage that was next to the lodge. You ready to go?
Oh yeah, I'm just shaking my head because who in their right mind would go out looking for dynamite? There's a metaphor there somehow, and please keep going.
Well, I think I know the metaphor, and he was playing with it. So he lit the fuse, and it literally blew up in his hands.
Oh my God!
Inside the garage, he was in there with one of the caretakers, and talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His bride was on the other side of the garage, along with another caretaker. So when the explosion took place, and this was, I should say, there were two explosions. There was the initial explosion, which brought people who were away from that area, heard the explosion, and they raced to the area, and the second explosion took place. And that's where they caught the shrapnel from the second explosion. So you have 4 injured people. You have 2 caretakers injured, Daniel and Daniel's wife.
Now, was there not a rumor that he had lit one stick, threw it out the door of the barn or wherever he was with this dynamite? It blew up. That's the people started coming towards the barn to see what was going on. He had lit another one, went to throw it out in the same place, saw the people, went to throw it out a window, and it bounced off the window. Is that not correct? Have I
I've heard that story too, and of course, we're not completely sure of his intent, whether his intent was to throw it out the window, but it never made it. So one was lit, and the intent was to throw it, and then he was to throw another one. And that one, he thought he had a 3-minute fuse on that one. It turned out to be 3 seconds. So it blew up immediately. Meanwhile, you had that secondary dynamite stick that was still going, that eventually blew up a couple of minutes later.
Oh my God!
That's where the other people were injured in that secondary explosion.
Now
Because they heard the first explosion and raced to the scene. And then the secondary explosion took place, and that's where they got hurt.
Now, Rick, was he killed outright?
No, he was seriously injured with internal injuries. His hand, I'm told that one of his hands was badly mangled. Lots of burns. Then there was another one of his caretakers that was outside the building, who was injured in the secondary explosion, was worse off than him, I was told. Lorraine had some bad cuts from shrapnel wounds, and the least injured one was the other caretaker, who was actually standing beside him when the initial blast took place inside the building. So multiple injuries, various degrees of injuries by these 4 people who were the victims. The only person that wasn't hurt was a 5th person, who was the cook, wife of one of the caretakers.
So there was somebody left to think, to try and mend bones, etc., etc. What took place next?
Well, it was determined that everybody needed medical attention right away because some of these injuries were life-threatening. So it was decided. So then they had to decide what is the best method to get to a hospital. And they chose to take Daniel's speedboat because, again, we talked about the road, the transportation system. It was more of a pasture than a road, and so they thought that they could get to a hospital quicker by taking a boat. So they got everybody down to the waterfront, and they all got into the boat. So there's 5 of them, again with various degrees of injury. And again, Daniel's the only one other than his wife that knows how to use the boat. He's seriously injured with I forgot to mention. Did I mention the fractured skull as well?
No.
So, no. Yeah, so he's got that as well. So he's not completely coherent.
No kidding.
Sort of semi-conscious. They get him in the boat. They get the other injured people into the boat. The only other person who has some knowledge of how to use the boat is his wife. The bride of 13 days.
And she's injured too.
And she's injured too. One of her arms is not working right, so she's using the boat with one hand. They only get about, so they were trying to get the little current. They only got halfway, and they're dealing with, it was a very windy, rough day out there in the North Channel. Take a drive, going on a boat, speedboat in Lake Ontario. Rough waters, 4-foot waves. They're having a terrible time trying to, get from point A to point B, and they got about halfway through, and she basically almost gave up, looking for somebody else to take over. And Daniel, of all people, the one who's one of the most seriously injured, who's laying in the back of the boat with a fractured skull and all these other injuries, burns, decides to get up and make an attempt, we speculate, to get to the front to take over the responsibility of getting them the rest of the way to the hospital, when somehow he goes over the boat, overboard, falls off the boat, loses his balance, we think, and into the water he goes. And
there's the mystery. Was he pushed, folks, or did he honestly fall over? And that's, I guess we should continue the rest of the story, and we'll come back to that pivotal moment in it, and we'll discuss your perspectives of it. How's that, Rick?
Sounds good.
Let's continue then. What happens then? Do they make it to shore, and do they circle back around to find him, or? Well,
initially they circle the boat to try. They see him bobbing up and down, and they want to try and retrieve him. And they were dealing with 4-foot waves, so they couldn't get the boat anywhere near him. And by the time they got to where he was gone. He had gone under the surface, and they couldn't find him. All they could do was mark the spot somehow with trying to determine where they were for a recovery team to come out and locate the body. So once they marked the spot where he went under, then they made their way towards a little current, which was the town on Manatoulin Island that had a hospital, and or one of the towns with medical attention. And so on they went and completed their journey, and they all received medical attention, and all of them survived. Lorraine was in the hospital for several days, as was one of the other injured members of that party.
Rick, what was the extent of her medical injuries? Was it just a broken arm? It sounds like it was quite a bit more if she was in the hospital that length of time.
It wasn't so much an arm was broken as it was cut up from glass and shrapnel because it blew the side of a wall apart, window and all that. So she caught all that flack when the dynamite blast occurred. So she was dealing with that. She had some plastic surgery that had to be done later on, and she had some problems with one of her legs too, I believe, that needed some attention. In later life, I've seen pictures of her, and you could see some of the scars on one of her legs. So she bore those scars for the rest of her life from that accident.
Who got in touch with the mother, Daniel Dodge's mother in Detroit? Was that her, or was that someone else, one of the caretakers?
I don't think that Lorraine was probably in any condition to be making the initial phone call. I'm sure that law enforcement agencies must have gotten in touch with him. And when that happened, a whole set of occurrences took place from their end, in terms of them organizing a recovery mission. Like they even set up a submarine to try and find the body, the Dodge family.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. A submarine. Brought it up on a rail car, but they offered a reward for the recovery of the body. Like all the fishermen gave up fishing for the next couple of weeks to spend time trying to find recover the body. It was found 3 weeks later.
3 weeks. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Dodge family spent a lot of their own personal money to find the body.
retrieve it and get it in.
Retrieve it.
Yeah. What a tragedy. What a tragedy. Now,
Yeah.
folks, we're speaking with Rick Nelson tonight. We're talking about the Daniel Dodge mystery that took place Manatoulin Island. He's just walked us through the scenario where Daniel Dodge, 20 years old, been married for 13 days, ends up dead. What he did, folks, was he took a piece of dynamite, hello, and I don't know what was going through his mind. Perhaps he didn't either. Lit the dynamite, and from all accounts, it exploded, caused damage in people that were standing near him, including his wife, and him as well, caused a concussion and burns all over his body. They jumped into a speedboat, quickest way from Manatoulin Island, a remote island in northern Ontario, to get to medical care. The only two people, unfortunately, that could drive the boat, Lorraine Dodge, his wife, who's already injured, bad arm, and Daniel himself, who is basically incoherent at this point. They get out on windy Lake Huron. They're going along in the speedboat, 4-foot waves, as Rick just described. And all of a sudden, for some reason, Daniel stands up and tries to make it to the front of the boat, perhaps to try and aid his wife, Lorraine, in driving. Who knows? And this is where the mystery gets thick, if you will. He ends up in the water. They leave him. They try to find him, pull him in. So they say they leave him, and then they make it to medical care themselves. 3 weeks later, the body is found. I smile, Rick, because this is a perfect scenario for a movie. You could go either way with this thing. You could say, yeah, in the split second, they had to make the choices, and who was in on the deed? Was it a dastardly deed, or was it indeed just an accident? He just stood up. What are your perspectives on this? I know you've weighed both sides, and let's examine both sides and take a look.
Well, I'll give you the short version. I don't believe that there was foul play involved. But I could see, because of the circumstances of this death, how conspiracy theories have continued to this day. That Daniel Dodge story on Manatoulin Island is probably the most talked about, famous story. It's a part of the lore of Manatoulin Island, and one of the reasons why we tell that story is because people come onto the island and want to learn more about Manatoulin Island. Tourists come to Manatoulin Island every year, and they're sent to our museum in Cagawon, the Old Mill Heritage Center, because we are the custodians of that story. And you walk into the museum, you'll see in a complete exhibit that is devoted to this story. People who come to our museum who may not even know the story are eventually find their way to that exhibit, and they're riveted by that story. It's our most popular exhibit on Manatoulin Island.
And you were telling me also people come from right around the world to view this exhibit.
That's
right.
And
I think that speaks testament not only to Manatoulin Island and this lore, as you say, but also to your integrity on building up this museum from virtually nothing. Now, folks, I want to tell you exactly where the museum is, because this is worth your trip. Trust me, especially if you're going across to Trans-Canada, and everybody does at one point during the summer. Most people go from east to west or west to east. Just outside of Sudbury, just to the west of Sudbury, is an Indian reserve called Manatoulin Island. Manatoulin Island, folks, is an Indian reserve, as just said. On this island is this museum. What's the name of the museum, Rick? Forgive me.
Yeah, it's the Old Mill Heritage Center.
Old Mill Heritage Center, where you can view a full display. It's a beautiful, beautiful location, and I'm going to be showing some pictures of it as I'm saying this. We were there last summer, and I thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyed it. It tells the whole story of the Daniel Dodge mystery, the lore behind it, but there's more in the museum as well, and perhaps you may want to touch on that a little bit too, Rick. What else is in the museum for folks?
Well, there's different components to the museum, sure. Daniel Dodge is one component. It's the most famous story that we have on Manatoulin Island. But there's a rich military history that goes with the island, and we tell that story as well through the exhibits, military artifacts that are there. Lester B. Pearson, Prime Minister of Canada, was the Member of Parliament for Manitoulin Island. So there's a political component to the exhibit telling the story of Lester B. Pearson and his time that he spent with us on Manitoulin. Also, the museum itself is a heritage building. It's a pulp mill, former pulp mill, and so we tell the story of the pulp mill as well with the artifacts that we have on it. Agriculture, of course, is big on Manitoulin, and we have a lot of artifacts that date back to, the early days of the settling of Manitoulin Island. Fishing, commercial fishing, boat building, all those and more is what will be found when you come to our museum. But again, the one story that everybody seems to come in to see us about, or if they come into the museum and they don't know anything about, they usually end up spending the most time at, is the exhibit for Daniel Dodge. And it's the Cinderella story behind it, the Romeo and Juliet,
That's right.
the two young people in love against the wishes of at least the Dodge family. And again, that disapproval of Daniel's choice of wives would explode after his death with the fight for the money.
I bet. And can we talk about that too? Now, I just want to ask you as well, Rick. I take it that her family, Lorraine's family, was all for the marriage.
I never heard a negative thing from that side of the family. I mean, it was like the pauper and the prince, right? Would that be a good?
Well, I like your Cinderella analogy too.
Yeah, the Cinderella analogy. She was marrying a prince. He was a prince, and they had bigger and better things in mind for him. The Dodge family. They were expecting he was going to marry some socialite from New York and live at the Waldorf Astoria, not up at a cabin on Manitoulin Island and during his leisure time. But that's what he wanted.
Now, apparently Daniel, from what I've read also, was a down-to-earth guy. He was, just because he had a lot of money, he certainly seemed to gravitate towards the fishermen and loved to talk with the local folks and hear their stories as well.
I never heard a bad thing about the guy from the locals because he wanted to be treated like a regular guy. When he was having his meals up at the lodge, he'd rather have them with the servants than sitting by himself, in his own section of the lodge. He just wanted to be with other people. He just wanted to, again, be treated like a regular guy. And that's why I think he tried to spend as much time as he could up here on Manitoulin Island to escape that type of lifestyle that his family wanted him to live.
I think that's an important component to this story as well, extremely so. Here's a guy that's trying to just be Joe Average, and his family's trying to force him into one direction. Perhaps he wanted to go in another. Let's talk about that explosion, about trying to get the money and whether it was justifiable and how the family fought all that, trying to prevent Lorraine from getting what was justifiably hers.
Well, he had a will and had just been recently updated to accommodate the fact that he now had a wife. And in that will, she was going to get about $150,000 plus the lodge. And that had been that. But she fought the will. Or I should say that she wanted to go over and above what she was going to get in the will. Because he was destined to get, the way it worked was his share of the Dodge family fortune was to be about $10 million at the age of 25. If for some reason that he died before the age of 25, then that $10 million was to be spread about with his siblings and his mother. So Lorraine felt that now that she was a family member, she should be entitled to that $10 million. And so she fought for her piece of the pie. And she got a piece of it. She did. After a court battle that probably lasted at least a year. But this is where the conspiracy theories started to begin to kick in. That the thought was, and to this day, I get people coming in and saying, Rick, really now, do you really think that this was an accident, or do you really think, she saw an opportunity? Here he was injured. Maybe it wasn't her fault, maybe, obviously, he blew himself up, but he wasn't dead. So maybe she saw an opportunity when they were going to the hospital, she saw the money. If she just, when nobody's looking, pushed him in. I get that all the time.
I guess it's inevitable, though, Rick, when you talk about large sums of money. I was just trying to put that in today's terms. I guess we'd be looking at close to $100 million, wouldn't we?
$10 million?
Would it be about 10 times? Because you think...
Oh, it had to be. Well, let's just think about this. The reward money to find the Dodge family put out a reward of $1,500 for anyone who could find the body. Now, $1,500 back in 1938 would have been 2 years' pay to the average person. So
extrapolate from that, and then go up exponentially.
And also, I should point out that Daniel was not destitute, even though he was expecting to get his $10 million at the age of 25. He was still getting an allowance through a trust fund. So he was, now think about this. This is 1938. He was averaging an allowance of $30,000 a month.
Oh my God! In 38.
1938, his allowance was about $30,000 a month.
Geez, I'd love that now.
So I know, a little bit of pocket change while you're waiting for your 10 million when you turn 25. So he was a wealthy kid with a lot of disposable income and time on his hands. And so here's all this money that's up for grabs now that he's dead. And Lorraine, the wife of 13 Days, decides that she is going to contest for that money, if that's the proper way of saying it.
Challenge to contest.
Challenge for a piece of the pie. And she got $2 million when it was all settled.
Which is a fair sum of money. Now, was she always ostracized by the family, Rick, or was she ever accepted eventually?
She was never accepted by the family while she was alive.
That's a shame.
She passed away when I'd say within the last 10 years she passed away, and was never accepted by the family. Now there has been a reconciliation by her family, her kids. Her son in particular, who now, I should back up here. What happened to Lorraine probably was going to be the next question, right? After she,
You could tell he's from radio, folks? He's an entertainment guy. He's done this before.
I mean, she married a couple of times. So she got her $2 million and lived happily ever after, married a couple of times. She had a son, the product of her third marriage. And he took a great interest in his mother's life as a brief member of the Dodge family. And by this point, we had the museum up and running. We were developing the Dodge story. We knew that this was a popular story and a story that was worth developing. We got in contact with the owners of the Dodge Lodge, the current owners. Now that Dodge Lodge has existed for the last 70 years. There's been a number of owners over the years. The current owners also were very interested in the history and wanting to partner with the museum in developing a proper storyline about Daniel and his wife Lorraine. So we eventually decided to have a reunion up at that lodge, and we invited members of the Dodge family and members from Lorraine's side of her side of the family to attend. So, and they did. and it took place 2 summers ago up there. And so there was a reconciliation between the two sides of the family 70 years later. It was a magical moment to see members of the Dodge family sitting having conversations with members of her side of the family, her son in particular, coming up and spending time with members of Daniel's side of the family.
It's nice to see that happen after all those years. It's too bad it couldn't have happened earlier. But I guess that just goes to show, folks, how things have changed, and perhaps we don't have that large a chasm anymore between the various classes, if you will. Perhaps that is disappearing somewhat, and thank God it is, because people are people are people. Now, Rick, I understand that the people that own the lodge now have had some mysterious experiences of their own. Perhaps Daniel is gone in the physical sense, perhaps not in the spiritual sense.
Well, they're completely convinced that Daniel is there. And over the years, people have had a sense that he's been around or been in the neighborhood. That area out there, now back then in 1938, was very remote, and there was as I mentioned, they had 500 acres of property. Well, that's all been severed off over the years. So there's a community out there. There's a subdivision out there now. And from what I've heard from the locals, that Daniel hangs out. There are a lot of people. Some people won't even go to the lodge.
Is that right?
Because they believe that he's there. And the people who currently own the lodge swear that he's there. And then Lorraine, now that she's passed on, is out there too, that they're together again.
I think he just went by you in the background, actually, there, Rick.
With the speedboat, went by with a speedboat.
Maybe. The romantic guy in me wishes that perhaps now that Lorraine has passed on, and if they were meant to be together, perhaps they're together now, and perhaps they're enjoying the life they should have had at the lodge. That's the feeling of the local owners, the current owners of the lodge, that they are together again, and this is where they're spending their eternity as the custodians, the spiritual custodians of the Dodge Lodge. Now, you admit I'm going to go back to conspiracy for a second, Rick, because you had mentioned that the $10 million, if he had died before he was 25 years old, would be assimilated between the various relatives, members of the family. Do you think the family had anything to do with the death of Daniel Dodge? Probably not, eh?
No, I haven't heard that one. That's a new one.
Night Fright, what can I tell you?
No, it's mostly, that's why she had to leave Manatoulin Island. Even though she was from Manatoulin Island, she was, a local girl. The trauma of this event and the theories and speculation that followed it haunted her for the rest of her life. And so she had to leave town. She moved away and would only come up occasionally for visits. And I think even when she was up, it was all those memories would come flooding back probably is a better way to describe it for her. But in conversations I had with her son, she was traumatized by this for the rest of her life, this whole event.
So she remarried, obviously, if she had sons or was with somebody.
Yeah, first married her plastic surgeon, and then...
it's a good way to save money. No, I'm teasing.
Save some money there. But that was a very brief romance, and then she married for a third time, and that gentleman and she were married for 50 years.
Wow.
That was a very long life. And she was, she made a life for herself. And again, we feel that she's returned to Manatoulin in a spiritual sort of way out at the Dodge Lodge.
Folks, incredible story tonight. I promise you a great journey. I'm glad you stuck around. It was well worth it. We're coming to the end now. We're going to have to start to wrap up. But once again, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on the picture associated with today's guests. That'll take you right to a spot where you can get more information on the Daniel Dodge mystery. Also, the Old Mill Heritage Museum. And Rick Nelson, of course, who many of you are probably recognizing right now, especially that wonderful silky voice, used to be the morning show host right here in Kingston, where we broadcast out of now. Used to be GT 960. And now is CKWS, and that's FM. And he was the morning show host for how many years, Rick? Were you a morning show host?
I was here for 5 years.
5 years.
Morning show for 5 years.
So people know you
here in Kingston. Great times in Kingston. I loved it. Made a lot of friends. Still have a lot of friends. When I come down, I try to look them up whenever I can. Some good people.
Absolutely.
You're in a good town, man.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, without question. And I was in Sudbury as well. I don't think there's a bad place in this whole country. This country's the best country in the whole world, folks, and I mean that from the bottom of my heart without question. I'm getting goosebumps as I say that. The story we told tonight is just one of many mysteries across this country from coast to coast to coast. 3 coasts in Canada, let's not forget that. This is one of them. We'll be doing some more, including Shag Harbor, that's Canada's Roswell. Official UFO crash, and they had submarines. It was the height of the Cold War, 1967. Had submarines coming in and aircraft carriers. NATO was on high alert. They didn't know what crashed in Shag Harbor in Nova Scotia. We'll be getting to that in a few weeks as well. Rick, I want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing this story with us. And people can email you, I suspect, if they wanted to.
They can. Just to make it simple, you can send it to my personal email address, rickynelson@hotmail.com. If you have any inquiries, questions, you want to learn about the story, or you want to know how to where to find us, if you're thinking about a trip, holiday to Manatoulin Island, there's a couple of different ways you can get on the island. A lot of people like taking the ferry out of Topomori. It's called the Chichiban. That'll get you to Manatoulin Island, and what a wonderful way to spend some time is up there in the Great White North. If you've exploited Kingston and you've seen everything you can see in Kingston now, it's time to come up to Manatoulin Island.
And folks, as one who has been there, you will not regret that trip. It is stunningly beautiful. There's beaches on the island, sandy beaches that go on for miles. You feel like you're in the Bahamas or something. The color of the water is turquoise. Fish and chips. Oh my God, will you taste the fish and chips on the island? Ice cream. Oh man, look at me. Hello, I was thin before I went there. All that to say is www.nightfrightshow.com. You'll find all that information. Just click on today's guest picture. That'll take you right there. I am Brent Holland from Night Fright. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And as always, please do send me some feedback. nightfrightshow@gmail.com. See you next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio.